Hey everyone! Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful stories of resistance in early American history, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. It's a story of courage, survival, and an unwavering fight for freedom. So let's get right into it. Back in 1680, most of the Pueblo people, who lived in what we now call New Mexico, rose up against Spanish colonizers in a rebellion that shook the region. This revolt, often referred to as Pope's Rebellion, was fueled by years of cruelty, oppression, and religious persecution. The Spanish had been forcing their beliefs and customs onto the Pueblo people, trying to wipe out their traditional practices and replace them with Christianity. But the Pueblo weren't willing to let go of their identity without a fight. The seeds of this rebellion were planted decades earlier. Starting around 1540, the Spanish began pushing into the region, bringing soldiers, missionaries, and settlers. They called these journeys entradas, but what they really brought was violence and disruption. One of the earliest clashes was the Tiguex War, fought between the Pueblo people and an expedition led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. This brutal conflict left scars that didn't fade. Fast forward to 1598. When Juan de Oñate led a group of soldiers, priests, and settlers into the Rio Grande Valley. At the time, around 40,000 Pueblo people lived in the area. Oñate's arrival was anything but peaceful. After a dispute at Acoma Pueblo, Oñate's forces attacked, killing and enslaving hundreds. The survivors faced horrifying punishments, including having their feet cut off. This event, known as the Acoma Massacre, left a deep sense of fear and hatred toward the Spanish. Over the years, Spanish settlers set up farms and forced the Pueblo to work for them, providing labor, food, and goods. Missionaries took over villages, trying to erase traditional Pueblo religion. At first, they tolerated some rituals as long as the Pueblo people attended church, but that changed. Priests started cracking down, banning sacred dances, burning religious objects, and even forbidding the use of plants in ceremonies. Anyone who resisted faced harsh punishment. By the 1670s, things got even worse. Droughts and famines hit the region, and raids by the Apache made life even harder. Pueblo leaders were desperate. In 1675, Governor Juan Francisco Trevino arrested 47 Pueblo medicine men, accusing them of witchcraft. 4 were sentenced to death. 3 were hanged, and the 4th took his own life. The rest were beaten and thrown into prison. This act of cruelty pushed the Pueblo to the edge. With Spanish soldiers distracted by Apache attacks, Pueblo leaders demanded the release of the prisoners. Trevino had no choice but to let them go. One of the men freed that day was Pope, a respected leader from San Juan Pueblo. He wasn't just angry, he was determined. Over the next 5 years, Pope traveled between Pueblo villages, gaining support for an uprising. Pope set up a plan to unite the Pueblo people, despite the fact that they spoke different languages and were spread out over hundreds of miles. He used Spanish as a common language and organized a system of messengers who carried knotted cords to count down the days until the revolt. Each morning, leaders untied one knot, and when the last knot was gone, it would be time to rise up. But just days before the planned attack, the Spanish found out. They captured and tortured 2 messengers to learn the plan. Pope, realizing they had to act fast, ordered the revolt to start immediately. On August 10, 1680, Pueblo warriors attacked. They cut off escape routes, stole horses to prevent the Spanish from fleeing, and began wiping out settlements. Around 400 Spaniards were killed, including women, children, and most of the Franciscan missionaries. Churches were burned, and symbols of Spanish authority were destroyed. The Spanish survivors fled to Santa Fe, where they made a final stand. But the Pueblo cut off their water supply, forcing them to retreat south. By the end of August, the Spanish were completely driven out of New Mexico. For the first time in over 80 years, the Pueblo were free from Spanish rule. So after the Spaniards fled, the Pueblo people were left in control of their homeland. Pope, the man who led the revolt, became a central figure in the aftermath. But he remains somewhat of a mystery even today, as different Pueblo stories paint varying pictures of what happened to him after the uprising. Pope, along with his close allies Alonso Catiti from Santo Domingo and Luis Tupatu from Picuris, took charge and traveled between villages. They pushed for a return to the old ways, calling for the destruction of anything linked to Spanish influence, churches, crosses, and Christian symbols. Puebloans were told to cleanse themselves with ritual baths, take back their traditional names, and abandon Spanish customs, including crops like wheat and barley. Pope even instructed those married in Catholic ceremonies to break those unions and follow older Pueblo marriage traditions instead. Despite his strong leadership, Pope faced challenges. The Pueblos didn't have a history of unified governance, and while some villages supported his vision, others resisted. The paradise he had promised, a life free from Spanish rule, didn't materialize. Droughts persisted, crops failed, and raids by Apache and Navajo tribes increased, leaving many Puebloans struggling to survive. Still, they remained committed, at least for a time, to keeping the Spanish from returning. Pope's time as leader didn't last long. About a year after the revolt, he was removed from power, and his name fades from historical records. It's believed he died shortly before the Spanish eventually made their way back in 1692. But before that reconquest, the Spanish made an earlier attempt to reclaim New Mexico. In 1681, Antonio de Otermin led an expedition with a small force of Spanish soldiers and native allies, heading north from Paso del Norte, which is now Ciudad Juarez. As they marched up the Rio Grande, they found abandoned Puro Pueblos and destroyed churches. At Isleta Pueblo, they faced some resistance but ultimately took control. Hoping to understand what had sparked the revolt, Otermin questioned captured Puebloans. Their responses, however, turned into a story that's almost legendary. When asked who led the revolt, the captives named figures like Payastiamo and Pohemo, deities in Pueblo religion, pointing toward the mountains as their supposed homes. It's unclear whether they were mocking Otermin or trying to protect Pope and other leaders, but their answers left the Spanish frustrated. Otermin's efforts didn't last long. The Puebloans began assembling a larger force, and by early 1682, he retreated back to Paso del Norte, burning villages as he left, and taking some Puebloans with him. Among those who relocated were the Isleta and Puro people, some of whom later returned to New Mexico, while others stayed in what is now El Paso. Over the years, Spanish attempts to regain control often failed, especially with groups like the Hopi, who resisted both Reconquest and peace treaties. But life wasn't easy for the Puebloans after the revolt. Food shortages, raids, and instability took their toll. Eventually, by 1691 or 1692, some Pueblo leaders reached out to the Spanish, inviting them back in hopes of finding stability. The Spanish saw an opportunity, especially as they feared French expansion into the Mississippi Valley. In 1692, Diego de Vargas led an expedition to Santa Fe with only 60 soldiers, native allies, and a few cannons. Despite being outnumbered, he promised protection and forgiveness to the Puebloans if they accepted Spanish rule and returned to Christianity. Many Puebloans agreed, and de Vargas officially reclaimed the territory for Spain. But the peace didn't last. When de Vargas returned in 1693 with more settlers, the Puebloans resisted, leading to a bloody recapture of Santa Fe. 70 Pueblo warriors were executed, and about 400 women and children were taken as servants. Even after this brutal crackdown, the Puebloans didn't give up entirely. In 1696, several Pueblos launched another revolt, killing settlers and missionaries, but the Spanish response was harsh and relentless. By the end of the century, the rebellion had been crushed, and most Puebloans had either surrendered or fled to join other tribes like the Apache and Navajo. Despite the Reconquest, the Pueblo Revolt had a lasting impact. It forced the Spanish to reconsider their approach. They granted land to the Pueblos, appointed officials to protect their legal rights, and eased up on religious persecution. Franciscan priests were more cautious about imposing Christianity, allowing the Pueblos to preserve many of their traditions. While the Spanish regained control, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 stood as a powerful example of indigenous resistance and survival.